Hi, I'm Leah and this is FilterFree Photography. Today I'm going to be talking about aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, the three values you need to understand if you want to take good photos, whether it's on a cell phone, a modern camera, or a vintage camera. So this is the first in a series of photography basics that I'll be covering on my channel. You might notice that although cameras are everywhere these days because they're attached to every single person's phone, the quality of pictures is actually pretty low. Now, to explore this, I've brought here with me today a vintage camera because it's all mechanical and you can see what's happening both in the lenses and in the camera itself. Although this is a vintage Pentax camera that I'll be using today to show you, not all of the images will be from this camera, and also it still applies to everything more modern than itself. Let me show you what I mean. So when I've opened my vintage camera's back here where the film would go in, you can see that there's a cloth shutter. The shutter is what you're going to be looking for to understand really what shutter speed does. So right now the shutter speed is at 1 second. What that means is that when I click the shutter, it lasts 1 second. You can see the shutter open and then 1 second later close. Modern cameras sometimes use an electronic shutter instead of an actual physical shutter, but this is still an important concept to understand. So now you'll see if I turn the shutter speed up to 1/15 of a second, it's much faster. And if I turn it all the way up to 1/1000th of a second, you can barely see it move. The important thing to realize about what's happening here with the shutter is that the faster your shutter speed, the less light it's letting in. And that really defines everything that changing your shutter speed is going to be about. It's all about letting in more light or less light, but that does lead to some odd characteristics in the photos that you take. So I'm going to show you some images now that I took at the university that shows you how different shutter speeds affect your image. So starting with a pretty regular scene here, this is taken at 1/60th of a second. It looks pretty good. However, if we zoom in on this person's foot, we can see it's actually a little bit blurry. We failed to capture it in motion. So if we raise our shutter speed a little bit so that it's faster, the scene gets darker, but you can also see that we've captured this foot a lot better. It's frozen in time a little bit more. So a similar idea here. The water droplets coming out of the nozzle in my bathtub here are moving a little bit too fast for this shutter speed, which is again, I think 1/60th. But as we raise the shutter speed so that it's, I think 1/250th, you'll see that although the scene has gotten darker because less light is being let in, the water droplets from the tap are actually caught. So we've used a faster shutter speed successfully to capture the motion of the water in the air. So now moving on to these two cute birds, you'll see that my shutter speed was fast enough in this photo to capture the birds, but not fast enough to capture the wings of this bird. That might not be a bad thing depending on the kind of photo that you want. Now using these very fast shutter speeds is giving you the chance to capture something that you can't see with the naked human eye. If you watch these Jenga blocks falling, you'll see that I used a burst mode on my camera with a very fast shutter speed so that the entire scene is captured in slow motion. Also interesting is that in the background you'll see that there are electric signs that are flashing at the same rate. This is showing you yet another thing that you would never really notice with the naked human eye. We've captured the flicker frequency of the electric signs in the background by using a shutter speed this quick. So let's return to this scene again and move in the other direction. So here we were at 1/60th, then 1/30th, moving slower and slower now. And now we're going down to 1/15th and you'll see people start to blur. And as our shutter speed gets slower and slower, they start to almost turn into hazy clouds. It's showing you a unique way of looking at the world that you would never see in real life because we're just not set up that way. So I think we're about down to a half a second here. And you'll see that things that don't move that much, like the group in the background or people's legs and feet, even while they're stepping, can be captured, but the rest of them is just a cloud. Now, I wasn't able to go any slower than 1 second in the daytime because I was making my aperture smaller and smaller on my camera to account for the fact that I was letting in more and more light. And eventually, I couldn't make my aperture any smaller, and so the scene would have gotten too bright. But if you wait until nighttime, you can capture really unique pictures, like this one. This is in the same location at the university, and it's a 30-second exposure. What's notable about this scene that you wouldn't notice right away is first, there were people there, but you can't see them because nobody stayed still long enough to be captured in a 30-second collection of light. Also, there were ripples in the pool, and you don't notice them because 30 seconds is so long that all the ripples completely average out into this mirror-like surface. Another thing that you can purposefully use slow shutter speeds for is if you want to create light trails. So if you have something that's making light, like a car, a bicycle, you can use a really low shutter speed and capture the movements of those light sources as trails across your image. So now that we've covered shutter speed and what that's doing to your image, it's time to look at aperture. What aperture is really just a fancy word for opening. Every lens has an opening. Right now this lens is at its maximum opening, which is f2. Don't worry about really what f2 specifically refers to right now. What's important to realize is that that's the widest that this lens opens. So if I stop it down, by which I mean close the aperture, the number goes up. So it's now at f5.6, and you can see that it has a smaller opening, a smaller aperture. Now I'm going to show you some more images that I took on campus and elsewhere to show you the effect that changing your aperture has on photos. So here we have a bench back at the university, and as we stop down our aperture, you'll see that the scene gets darker and darker. But if I account for that and we go back to it, you'll see that there's also only a little bit of it that's actually in focus, and that as we decrease our aperture, what you're going to see is that more and more of it becomes in focus and the background gets a little bit sharper as well. Let's take a more artistic example. Here's a flower in Vancouver. And what I'm going to do is first show it to you at f1.8, so the widest that my lens would go, and you get this really beautiful blurred background that we call bokeh. And then as we stop it down, the amount that's in focus goes up, and also the background gets a lot less unfocused. So let's just start that over and show it to you again. So it's very blurry and artistic looking, and then as our aperture gets smaller, we see more of the scene becomes in focus. Now if we look at our cute birds again, I had that large aperture to blur out the background, but it also had the unintended effect of making it so that you couldn't see the bird in the front. And when the bird in the front was in focus, the bird behind it was slightly out of focus. So when something is really close to your camera, it can be very difficult to keep everything in focus. With portraits of people, this often ends up with having only one eye in focus. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes you want that, but it is something you should know going in. If you want both eyes in focus and your model is close to the camera, you might have to stop down your aperture a little. So in this photo, which I took of Toronto at dawn from my plane seat, although there are some things on the ground which are closer and some which are farther away, they're all so farther away from me that they're all what we call at infinity, and so they're all equally in focus. It doesn't actually matter how large or how small my aperture is here. Everything's going to be equally in focus as long as I'm focused at infinity. The one thing that you might not have noticed about the preceding pictures, though, is that the widest open a lens is also the least sharp it is usually. So although you get that really nice blurred background, it's also not going to be as sharp as if you stopped the aperture down a little bit. And so the maximum sharpness you usually get from a lens is around f11 or f13, after which it can become a little bit soft again, but it's just something to keep in mind. Better lenses will be sharper even at wider apertures, but it will always be sharpest as you get closer to f11 or f13. Something you probably noticed when I first changed the aperture on this lens is that wide open, it's a perfect circle when you look through it, but as soon as it's stopped down a little bit, it becomes a hexagon. And that does have an effect on the images that you take. I'll show that here. So here you can see a photo that I took of this person with the lens wide open. But then as I stopped it down a little bit, as my aperture became a bit smaller, it also became hexagonal. And you can see that there are little hexagons sort of in the background in the bokeh, what we would call bokeh balls. And this has changed very slightly the way the photo looks and also the kind of character of the blurred background. So as I close the aperture, that is, as I make the opening smaller, I would have to have a longer shutter speed to compensate for that. That means that anytime you're changing the aperture, the shutter speed's going to have to change too. Similarly, if the shutter speed gets faster, that is letting in less light, you're going to need to open your aperture up wider to let in more light to compensate for that. These two values should always be seen as linked together. There are some exceptions to this, but you're constantly going to be playing a balancing game of how open your lens is and how fast your shutter is. So finally, now that we've looked at shutter speed and aperture, it's time to talk about ISO. ISO is going to have the least amount of time devoted to it in this video because it's very easy to understand. What ISO originally referred to was the sensitivity of the film that was made for a film camera, such as this one. So if something had a more sensitive film, you could use it in darker places. Unfortunately, when a film was more sensitive to light, it also meant that it would show more noise in the image or graininess in film. If you're using a modern camera and you're walking around in the daytime, it's probably going to tell you that it's at ISO 100. So when you're looking at ISO on your camera, the lower the number, the less sensitive to light it's going to be, but the sharper the image. And by sharper here, I don't mean as in focus or blurry, but rather there's going to be less noise in the image. In the film camera days, that was expressed as grain, but in digital cameras, it's literally digital noise. And I'll show you an example of that here. So here's a scene, again at the university, at ISO 250, and as I bring up the ISO, you'll see that the quality of the image starts to go down. So the one thing that I haven't shown you here is that as the ISO goes up, the scene will also get brighter. The only reason you haven't seen that in these photos is because as I've raised the ISO, I was also making my aperture smaller and my shutter speed faster. So again, what this means is that with a higher ISO, you're getting more digital noise, but you're also able to take pictures with less light available. So for whatever your reasons are for learning photography, from learning to get the most out of your cell phone or maybe returning to photography after several years, it's crucial to understand how aperture, shutter speed, and ISO are going to affect your image. So if you found this video useful, please don't forget to like and subscribe and comment below if you have any questions or comments if I've gotten anything wrong. I'll be talking about other basics of photography in further videos, so if you have any recommendations on what I should cover, please let me know. Thanks for watching.